Hello there, you're watching the press preview. A first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with Stephen Bush, Associate Editor and columnist at the Financial Times, and Kate Andrews, Economics Editor of the Spectator. Well, let's see what is on some of those front pages. Well, Stephen's paper, the FT, leads with tonight's news from Jordan. And this headline, Iran-backed militants kill 3 US troops in drone attack. The Guardian says the attack has heightened fears of a direct conflict between the United States and Iran. The Metro reports on the fatal stabbing of 2 teenagers in Bristol, latest victims of what it calls the UK's knife epidemic. The Eye claims an exclusive with news that Labour's plans to charge VAT on private school fees could hit deprived children trying to get into state grammar schools. Head teachers are concerned. The Express leads with Cabinet Minister Kemi Badenoch's warning to Tories hoping to topple Rishi Sunak to stop messing around and accept that the Prime Ministers are not disposable. The Mail claims rail bosses have been pocketing big payouts despite failing to stop the recent run of train strikes. And the Star leads with what it calls our balmy weather, an Arctic blast last week and a heat wave this week. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code that you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Stephen Bush, Associate Editor and columnist at the Financial Times, and Kate Andrews, Economics Editor of The Spectator. Welcome both. OK, let's start with a story that we have been talking about here on Sky News as well, front page of the Bristol Post. And it is those stabbings in Bristol. The headline, boys stabbed to death in double murder, front page of the Bristol Post. Stephen, what did you make of it and the coverage?
Well, obviously, it's a tragic and horrible story. The sad thing is it's a tragic and horrible story that feels increasingly familiar. It feels, it feels that every week there's a push notification on my phone about a stabbing, and it clearly is a real and growing problem, but it's, of course, just an awful story and an awful tragedy for those 2 boys and their families.
And it links, of course, the issue Stephen was mentioning of knife crime that we're seeing.
Yes, in the capital, it's up 22% between 2022 and 2023. There's been a lot of talk in recent days about the kinds of crackdowns that might be implemented to deal with this around zombie knives. Labour's pledging £100 million more to try to tackle the issue of knife crime directly. It raises a lot of important questions we have to ask about criminalisation, about how we deal particularly with teenagers who get caught up in gang violence, who get caught up in carrying around knives, and the best way to deal with that between criminalisation and rehabilitation and the rest of it. But as Stephen says in this particular story, it's a real tragedy, a 15, 16-year-old boy who've both passed away. There's a man and a teenager in custody at the moment. We don't have the full details about this, but, nothing positive to say, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that it's front page of the Bristol Post, which, of course, you'd expect because it happened in Bristol. But, we haven't seen all of the front pages, but I haven't seen it as one of a big story on any of the other front pages of the Nationals. So it's something that, still doesn't get discussed to this level at a national level, perhaps as much as it should.
I think that's an important point. We see it on the front page of the Metro, but as you say, it's missing from a lot of other front pages. And to Stephen's point, the story has become slightly uncomfortably familiar to the point where you hear it and you think again.
Yeah.
And oftentimes that can actually push things down the news agenda rather than raise them up. It's an interesting point about what does get covered.
Stephen, let's go to your paper, the Financial Times. Their front page, Iran-backed militants kill 3 US troops in a drone attack. And, of course, this is the breaking news that we had in the past few hours. And we've had reaction from the United States. It's always the same question, the risk of this escalating.
Yeah, in a sense, this story is a sign that escalation has already happened. So the key players in this are the Islamic Resistance of Iraq, which is an Iran-backed militant group based out of Iraq. The US has been very reluctant to do anything which would cause it to be in a direct confrontation with Iran. But, of course, there's a particular issue in a presidential election year where Donald Trump is effectively saying, not quite in these words, but is essentially saying, well, under me there would be direct escalation, and that may push Biden into a position where he has to do something and is more escalatory. And, of course, we've got the disruption of shipping caused in part by the fallout of the war between Israel and Hamas. It does feel like it's a major escalation in a conflict which has no end in sight.
And what did you make of it, Kate? Also, because it's an election year, and Biden sort of can't win because, you know, there's this risk of escalation. Israel isn't really listening to America when it gives it some advice, but also America can't seem to contain the situation escalating.
Well, these proxy wars are certainly heating up. I don't think there's any doubt in the U.S. at the moment that President Biden will continue to remain committed and an ally of Israel. But as we're seeing, there are a lot of proxy wars popping up in the process of that. It's not just Hamas's horrible terror attack against Israel, but we now see the Houthis in Yemen responding in the Red Sea. We're now seeing these proxy wars on the border of Syria. We have 3 U.S. troops dead. That does put pressure on President Biden, and he has said that the U.S. will hold all those responsible to account at a time and a manner of our choosing. Yeah. That is de-escalating the situation to some extent. But as Stephen says, he does have President Trump, who is now looking very much to be the nominee, right on his back. And Trump's line is, if it had been me the past 4 years, you wouldn't be seeing any of this. I would have contained it. Now, those are some very big ifs. But Donald Trump will be pointing to the Abraham Accords that he got through when he was president. And it really does put pressure on Joe Biden's foreign policy.
And I have to say, in the past few minutes, we've had reaction from David Cameron. Let me just bring it to you. So David Cameron posted on X in the past few minutes. He said, "We strongly condemn attacks by Iran-aligned militia groups against U.S. forces. We continue to urge Iran to de-escalate in the region. Our thoughts are with those U.S. personnel who have lost their lives and all those who have sustained injuries, as well as their families." So, you know, that reaction that we've had there from the Foreign Secretary. OK, let's stay still with the Financial Times. Another story in the front page. EU drafts plan to cripple Hungarian economy if Orban blocks Ukraine cash. Stephen, what's the story about?
So this is a plan that our reporters have got hold of. So the challenge that the EU faces is that essentially on the matter of how to deal with Russia, it's sort of 27 against 1. Hungary is much more pro-Russia than any of the other nations in the bloc. But because foreign policy is still largely a reserved competence, it's one where there's not qualified majority voting, it's done by unanimity. Hungary can and has vetoed many measures than the rest of the bloc would like to do. So this plan is partly a sort of measure of stick to essentially say to Hungary, look, if you don't get on board with the programme, then there are going to be economic consequences for you. But it does reflect the sort of remarkable challenge that Hungary presents to the EU. The EU was able to sort of shrug off the exit of a member in the United Kingdom, but it's much more difficult to deal with a member who's sort of quite hostile to the shared security aims of everyone else around that table in the bloc, and who doesn't want to leave and wants to keep vetoing things. And it doesn't mean drawing up a plan that in many ways goes against the central function and achievement of the EU, which is the spread deepening of free trade and economic integration within the bloc.
Okay. This is a fantastic scoop from the FT that they've seen this document. And as Stephen points out there, the EU is in an incredibly difficult position where it is supposed to be a model of a free trade bloc. You know, its sole purpose, well, once upon a time, actually not anymore, but once upon a time its sole purpose was really to advocate and promote free trade. And the fact that you're talking about the centre, Brussels, actively trying to come up with ways that it could hurt one of its members' economies by spooking the markets, creating a run on the country's currency because of a dispute over foreign policy, shows all the ways actually in which the EU really has expanded, and it's made life quite difficult. Now, I think a lot of people would look at Hungary's stance on Russia and its cozy relationship and think that's a terrible position to be in, but you know, it's a terrible line that's being taken by Viktor Orban. But it is remarkable that the EU of all blocs would then be trying to go after one of its own members' economies.
Okay, let's take a look at the front page of the Eye now. Labour private school tax set to squeeze deprived children at some grammar schools. Stephen, this is the kind of thing that, you know, a lot of people feel very passionate about. What's the story and what's your take?
So the story here is one of Labour's very few tax rises that they've enumerated is this change in the taxable status of private schools. So they will face the same tax regime as, you know, private healthcare, any of the other private things you can claim. They will lose that VAT exemption. And now there have been a variety of stories about what this would mean for the rest of the sector. Because, of course, although many people would be able to afford the rise in fees, some people wouldn't. And this story is essentially saying, look, what would happen is this would create pressure on grammar schools that would, push people out, and then this would have the strongest effect on the most deprived. To be honest, I kind of think that this story is almost certainly the latest salvo in the ISC, which is the Independent Schools Trade Association, trying to put the frighteners on this story. They haven't been successful yet. This policy is very popular in the abstract. The question, of course, is will it be popular once it's implemented? I actually suspect that the schools which will be most controversial will not be grammar schools. It will be schools which are providing specialist education for people with specific learning difficulties.
OK, we have a minute.
Well, look, Stephen covers it well there. Labour have not wanted to get specific about their tax policy because it's much easier to, hold a popular position when you're not getting specific. This is one area they've been very clear they're going to do, so it's not surprising that there is most scrutiny on it. There have been big questions around whether or not it will raise $1.6 billion. There have been big questions around, as Stephen points out, whether or not it's actually going to create pressures on certain kinds of schools. But what I think we're pretty certain about is Labour is not backing down from this one. They continue to think it's popular. Whether or not it actually raises the money is another question.
Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. With me once again are Stephen Bush, Associate Editor and Columnist at the Financial Times, and Kate Andrews, Economics Editor of The Spectator. OK, let's go to the Daily Express, and a headline here, and a quote from Kemi Badenoch. Stirring Tory plotters must stop messing around. And basically, this is a message to those who insist that she might be a replacement for Rishi Sunak. Kate.
So these comments come after Sir Simon Clarke, former Levelling Up Minister under Liz Truss, called for the Prime Minister to go last week. I think two things are happening here. You have the Trade Secretary on Sky News coming out and defending the Prime Minister, as you would expect from a Cabinet Minister, defending the government, making, I think, the important point that this is not helping the party in the year of an election. But, of course, Badenoch's name has been caught up in some of these discussions because she is often touted as a potential leader of the party, whoever may come next. And I suspect that she doesn't want people to think that she herself is plotting. And also, if you do have ambitions to be the next Tory leader and indeed one day Prime Minister, you might not want that switchover to happen so soon with the way that the polls are looking. So you might want to take some more time.
Bit of a poison chalice right now.
I'm not sure Kemi Badenoch or anybody else who might have ambitions would want to see the baton passed to them right now.
Stephen?
Well, I think, these remarks which she made on Sky this morning do show that Downing Street's actually had quite a good crisis in terms of its handling of it, right? What are the things you need to do to hold off a coup? You name the plotters, so you disincentivise other people joining them, and then you get the biggest threat to you in the cabinet, which is Kemi Badenoch, to go around doing the morning round saying she's behind the Prime Minister. So although they still have many, many problems, I think if I were working in Downing Street, I'd feel pretty pleased with myself for how I had contained the threat over the past couple of days.
Do you think she is a possible future leader of the Conservatives?
She polls very well. I know Sky was showing some of that polling earlier on in terms of the grassroots, so it's certainly possible. But to Stephen's point, publicly, she's being very clear about her support from the Prime Minister right now. This is not thought to be at the top of her priority list.
OK. Let's go to The Guardian front page there. Angela Rayner. Rayner, councils fund just a sticking plaster. And this is Angela Rayner accusing the Conservatives of cynically applying a sticking plaster to council finances to get, of course, through to the election. Stephen, what do you make of this?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, it is, if you look at, what the IFG has estimated and what the LGA, the local government, has estimated councils need to get them on a sustainable path, the amount that the government has put forward is not enough. It is, however, enough to mean that the run-up to election day won't be local authorities going bankrupt, having to, raise council tax, do lots of things you wouldn't want to be happening in your closing argument as a government. But, of course, the difficulty for the Labour Party is it's one thing to point out this is a sticking plaster solution. There's nothing in this statement suggesting that the Labour Party would be willing to spend more on the problem. And I think this is going to be the big challenge for them over the next year, is people will listen to their critique of the government and go, yeah, that's fair, but then they'll listen to the alternative, and I think there's still lots of questions about whether or not Labour has really got enough of a plan to tackle some of these problems.
Yeah, I think that's completely right when the Institute for Government is saying that it's going to take £7 billion more in cash to get government funding up to where it was in 2010. The question for the Labour Party is, where is that money coming from? If you agree that that hole has to be filled and that you can't fill it through productivity gains or efficiency gains, as the current government would like to say, it raises big questions for Labour. If you're not going to raise income tax, as they've said, if you're not going to have a wealth tax, as they've said, where are you finding the money? They haven't answered that question yet.
They haven't. Let's take a look at the front page of the Daily Star now. Britain's 19.6 degrees in January. So it's a heat record, days after shivering in Arctic blasts. So this is, in some parts of Scotland, 19.6. And just a few weeks ago, it was minus 14. So if you live in that part of the UK, you really don't know what to wear when you leave the house these days. Stephen, I mean, obviously, you know, cold weather we're expecting, but this is unseasonable, to say the least.
Well, this is what some climate scientists call global weirding, right? Which is where climate change causes all sorts of strange effects and moves how the Gulf's around, which causes the climate to do weirder things, which causes bits of the harvest to do weirder things. Yeah. And we're kind of living through that right now, this deeply weird, this January where I kind of felt like I've gone into my autumn clothing, I've gone into my winter wardrobe, but some days it's felt I needed to get my summer clothes out, you know, out of a cupboard somewhere. And this is going to be the future from now on, is weirder and weirder weather.
In fairness, the previous record was hit in 2003. So, you know, 20 years ago, I think they went to 18 at a similar time of year. Kate, what do you think?
I think it's also very important for people to remember that while it may be warmer than usual, you still need to bundle up, especially at this time of year. Pressure on the NHS in January and February tends to be heightened, particularly because people get colds. And especially if you're elderly, if you're vulnerable and you're getting cold, don't be deceived by the warmer weather. Make sure that you're taking care of yourself.
I doubt it's going to stay 19 degrees for long. It's probably just a blip and it's all over.